I've got a slatted rack in here. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but it's too far down the stack for me to show you. It's just a little box. It's got slats that run under the frames. And what it really does is it provides a little foyer. And I like it in all seasons of the year. In the summer, this gives the bees somewhere to cluster that's outside of the brood nest, so they're not contributing extra heat to the brood nest. But in the winter, I really like a slatted rack because that little foyer there, it provides an extra buffer against the wind and cold, keeps the bees that much more separated from the environment outside. So I like a slatted rack in there. And then in my hives, okay, now I work in all medium boxes. A medium box is about 2/3 of a deep box. So for me, 3 mediums is the same as 2 deeps, okay? So in my setup with mediums, most of my hives are going to go into winter with 2 brood boxes, a box of honey, and then above this, I'm going to have emergency food for them. So this is my inner cover here. This box just surrounds a feeder. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then a lid. Okay, and I'm not going to go too deep on brood arrangement in here, but you can see I got some tape. I don't know if you can read it back there, but when I go in and rearrange everything for the last time before winter, I'm going to set it up with a solid frame of honey on both sides of all the brood boxes. Now this is, it's food easily accessible if they want it like that. Probably they're not even going to eat that. And by spring it's going to be something nasty and gross. But it serves an important function beyond just being food. It's not exactly an insulator. It's more like just thermal mass that's going to help them maintain a regular temperature inside. These big slabs of honey on both sides of the brood is really important for them to keep the cold out. So I always set it up, solid slab of honey on both sides of the brood boxes. Somewhere I'm going to have a solid sheet of pollen in each brood box, and that's in addition to the pollen that's actually on their brood frames. Okay, and same deal with the pollen. Odds are they're not going to touch it, and in the spring it's going to be gross and moldy, and I'm going to scrape it off into the garbage. But if they want it, I want to make sure that they have it there. And even if it doesn't get used, it also serves that same purpose of being insulating mass to help them maintain their temperature in there. Okay, so now above, and then I'll have brood frames across the rest. And you know, if I'm a couple brood frames short, I'll just slot in a couple more frames of honey. If I'm a couple brood frames over, I might have a couple brood frames up in this one. But mostly that's how that's going to go. And then I'm going to give them more or less an entire box of honey on top. Now, my bees basically never eat that whole box of honey. Usually they only eat about half of it. Now some of my bees are less frugal and they really will go through all of it. But most of them, they're only going to eat half of that. So a good way to take up some space, either in the brood nest or in the honey box, I like to use one of these double frame feeders. And this just takes 2 slots. So if I didn't have enough brood to go around, maybe I'm putting this in here. That's 2 less slots I have to worry about. If I don't want to give them a whole box of honey, maybe I'm putting it up here. It's 2 less slots of honey. And this is nice because you might have needed to use this leading up to winter. You might be using this right now, like making sure you top up their food. And you might want to use this again in the spring. So if it's already in there, great, pour some sugar in it. So yeah, this is pretty common in my winter setup as a spacer and also as a feeder. Okay, now if they do eat all of that honey and they get all the way up to the top and they've run out of food, you really had better have something waiting for them there. So there's a lot of options. You can go like fondant or sugar bricks and all that. I go with just plain granulated sugar. And I like this feeder, this top feeder. It is my favorite for wintertime emergency food. Now when you get this thing, it's going to have this stupid nipple sticking out of the bottom. so that it only fits on round holes and you can never set it down. First thing you do when you get this feeder is lay a hacksaw up against the side and cut that stupid nipple off. And now it can sit flat, and now you can use it on top boards that don't have a round hole, and it becomes universal. Okay, so this feeder, here it is, it's filthy, but you can see it has this little clear cup. So usually you're using this for liquid food, and this clear cup keeps the bees in the cup where they can access the liquid, but they can't go drown in it. Well, in the winter, I'm going to take this cup out, and I'm just going to fill this with dry sugar. And now the bees can get up in there. And I'll set that right up there. And now if they eat all their honey and they make it to the top and they're getting hungry, what do they find? They find some emergency food. It's also really nice because you can check their status really easy throughout the winter without opening the hive. You just lift the top up, peek under there. They either have or haven't eaten their sugar, and now you know something about their condition. So this is my favorite feeder for wintertime feeding.
Where do you get them?
You can get them all over the place, man. Lake to Down to Earth sells them. Better Bee. They're pretty common. They're pretty common, although every manufacturer makes them slightly different. So if you're going to buy several, make sure you get it from the same place. You'll notice mine has crossed out numbers and stuff. That's because I have about 6 different pressings of this, and I have to make sure to get the cup and lid lined up. So if you're going to buy multiples, get them from the same place. Yeah. And as soon as you see the picture of it on the website or whatever, you'll recognize it for what it is. There's other formats. There's square, and there are a bunch of different shapes and sizes. But this is the kind of feeder that I like for winter feed.
Pretty much any liquid feeder can be a solid feeder?
No, not so much. Like, I've got a couple goofy feeders outside in the free pile right now that I've never used them. They look like they're great liquid feeders. They would definitely not work for dry food. This one works out because you can just remove this cup, and now you can put dry food in it. You put that cup back in, now it's only for liquid. Okay, so that's kind of how I'm setting that up. Now to talk about actually winterizing. First, let's talk about moisture. Okay, I'm going to start that off. We're going to have a little chemistry lesson here, okay? So sugar's a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In fact, carbohydrates they're exactly like hydrocarbons, propane, butane, gasoline. They're exactly like hydrocarbons, except they have a wad of oxygen stuck to them. But when you burn a carbohydrate, you get the exact same exhaust products that you get when you burn a hydrocarbon. Okay, when you oxidize carbon, what you get is CO2. When you oxidize hydrogen, what you get is H2O. So when you burn a carbohydrate, sugar, the exhaust products are carbon dioxide and water. Okay, now, so you poop out all the non-digestible parts of your food, but you exhale the exhaust from all of your food that you did digest. That's where the carbon dioxide comes from when you exhale. That is the waste product of all of the carbohydrates that your body has digested. And the water, like you fog a mirror, that water, that's not water you drank. That's the exhaust gas from the carbohydrates that you've digested. So, when the bees, side note, our sugars, the ones we care about, fructose and glucose, that's the sugars in the honey, they are C6H12O6, which happens to be almost exactly like hexane, except with 6 oxygens on it. But anyway, so when if the bees eat 10 pounds of honey, they're going to have to inhale 8.5 pounds of oxygen in order to metabolize that. They're going to exhale 12 pounds of CO2 and 6.5 pounds of water. So that means when the bees eat a gallon of honey, they exhale more than 3/4 of a gallon of water. That's where the water is coming from in your hive. This isn't condensation out of the atmosphere. This is the exhaust from them eating the honey. And that's where the water's coming from. Now, the bees have been eating and breathing for 350 million years. They know what to do with this water. The water in your hive is not a problem. They've evolved exhaling all this water. So you don't need to worry about soaking it up or blowing it out or anything like that. This water is normal. It's been with them since the dawn of time. So I don't ventilate. I don't use quilt boxes or anything like that. This water belongs there. Not only does it belong there, but they need it. They need water to drink, but also they can't eat honey. It's too thick to suck up their little straw mouth. They have to get water, bring it to the honey, melt the honey down into something thinner before they can even ingest it. So the water's not a bad thing in there. Now that being said, what is bad is cold drops of water dripping down through the brood nest in the middle of the winter. Now in a natural cavity, it's probably irregular on the ceiling. It's going to come to a dome, or it's going to be a rotten wood. They're not going to have a flat ceiling above them to drip water down the middle of the brood nest. So one thing I do is when I'm coming into winter, I just tip all my hives forward a couple inches. And now, the water that condenses on the ceiling can run down and then run down the front wall, rather than dripping straight down the middle of the brood nest. It'll drip to the front and run down the wall.
2 inches?
Yeah, or whatever. You know, don't tip it over. I mean, the more it's tipped, the more efficiently it's going to run that moisture down. Okay, next let's talk about ventilation. Okay, so the bees are really good at ventilating their hive. They know how to do this. They are able to bring air in, circulate the entire hive, and exhaust it all from that tiny hole. It's how they know how to control their airflow. This again, they've been doing this a really long time. They know how to circulate air through their hive. But the moment you go opening multiple holes, it throws off their ability to control the airflow. Like if you open your screen bottom board, or if you open a top opening, suddenly they can't control the air anymore, because the way they know how to control their air is bringing it in, circulating it, and exhausting it all through that small hole. Anything outside of that, it confounds their ability to control the airflow. So even in the wild, if bees move into a tree and there's multiple holes, they will usually close all of the holes except for the lowest one, because this is how they know how to control their air. And also, they're trying to create an envelope above that hole that will trap the bubble of hot air in the winter. If there's a top opening, you create a chimney, and the convective current just sucks all the hot air out of there. They want it to be closed at the top to trap that bubble of hot air, help keep them warm. So if you're opening a top entrance in an effort to control moisture, after the couple things I've just talked about here, what will happen is you can create a convective current, it sucks their heat out. Now they need to go consume more honey to generate and replace that heat, thereby creating more water. So if you're trying to control moisture by sucking their heat out the top, what you're actually doing is forcing them to make more water. So it's counterproductive. And it overworks them. Now they have to sit there pulsing their wings all winter long, generating more and more heat. And a bee's lifetimer ticks away with every beat of the wing. Even in the winter, even those winter bees, every tick of the wing muscles, that's how their life ticks away. That's why foragers get about 2 weeks before they drop dead in the field. It's the flight that kills them. So don't make them sit there heating if they don't need to. So yeah, I do not open top holes in the winter. I want them to keep their heat. In fact, I go through all of mine and I seal any top hole. And I saran wrap all my box seams.
do enough of the job with the sulfur?
Well, the problem is my last visit was probably in October, when it's past propolis gathering season and it's really too cold for them to rework what they already have. So if I hadn't have been in there, I'm sure they would have it sealed up. But because I was in there late in the season, I gotta provide my own propolis. So there's my ventilation right there. All of it sealed except the bottom. Okay, now let's talk about insulation. So the point of the insulation is not to keep them warm, although it does help keep them warm, and it reduces their caloric needs and lowers the thermal stress that they're under in the winter. But the point of insulating is not to keep it warm, it's to smooth out the daily temperature spikes. When the sun comes out, the temperature spikes, the cluster breaks. The sun goes down, the temperature drops, they have to recluster. Now, just like heating your home, it costs you more to reheat your home each day than it would have cost you to just leave it at 65 the whole time. It's the same deal with them. When they break cluster, it's in response to the heat. They're going to go out, they're going to spread out around the hive, doing stuff. They're not going to recluster until it's already cold, because they're going to recluster in response to the cold. So by the time they recluster, temperature has already dropped, and now they have to battle to get the temperature back up. And they have to do this every single night. In a wild situation, in a tree cavity, the walls of a hollow tree are going to be like, 2 to 12 inches thick of solid wood. So the tree, it's going to follow the seasonal temperature variation, but it's going to be really resistant to daily spikes. Inside of several inches of wood, you're not going to feel the difference between night and day. And so that's what the bees are accustomed to. And that's what I try to recreate by insulating. I'm not trying to keep them warm. I'm just trying to smooth out the daily temperature spikes. Like, it's better to keep your bees cold and constant than to let them spike up and down, up and down. And another part of that is when they feel the sun hit this wall and it warms up, they might think that it's a beautiful warm day out there and they're going to go out and enjoy it. And they end up dead in the snow because the sun hits the box and heats this up faster than it heats up the rest of the world. So that daily spike, not only does it drain their energy and their honey reserves, but it also convinces them to go out when it's far too cold to go out. So best to just keep it constant and cold. Now that also means things like you might have seen people want to wrap their hives in things like tar paper and black plastic in an attempt to increase the solar gain, to get more heat out of the sun each day. This is exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing. You want to keep them a constant temperature, even if that's very cold. Bees can survive in really cold temperatures as long as it's a constant temperature. You don't want them to break cluster unnecessarily. You don't want them to have to reheat the hive. So yeah, no black plastics and stuff. So what I do for insulation, now the most important part of insulation is the top. All of that breathing they've been doing, all that water they're generating, it's coming out as vapors, and it's going to condense to the coldest thing in the area. So if you insulate the top, then you'll know that the top is warmer than the sidewalls. And now the water will condense to the sidewalls and run down the sides so that it's not dripping through the brood nest, as I was talking about before. So in this box with my feeder, I've got something like this. This is just 4 inches of styrofoam, and it fits in this medium box right on top of the feeder. Now my top is heavily insulated, even if my sidewalls aren't. And you can get by just fine with a setup like that, insulating only your top, just to prevent condensation on the ceiling and encouraging the condensation on the walls where the water can run down. Now, I do go further than that. So my standard table is 12 feet long, so it could fit 6 hives on there. But I normally stock it with just 4, 2 in the middle and 2 on the ends, leaving 2 empty spots, so I always have somewhere to stack boxes and work next to each hive. Well, as I'm coming up into the winter, I start the gradual process of scooting them all together. And I bring all my hives so close together that their lids are touching, or overlapping if they're different heights. But I bring them all the way together, and then I use this. This is just 1-inch styrofoam. And what I do is I wrap all of them together. So I'll have all my hives up touching, I'll go around the ends, and then I wrap them all together. Right? So imagine we have 3 more hives running down the table here. And then I'll just stick them in with the whatever the right size screw so I'm not going all the way through. There we go. Bam. And I'll wrap my whole 4-pack just like this. Make sure you leave plenty of room around the entrance. And also, if you're doing oxalic acid from the back, make sure you're not covering your hole. You're going to want that in a couple of months. So I'll go all the way around the outside. And then I'll also go all the way across the top of the whole 4-pack. And probably just use a ratchet strap to tie that part down. And that is how I set my bees into winter.
Even down to where your hive is located. So my hives, for example, are up against a blackberry row, and it's pretty dense so that they don't get a lot of wind. So I don't really worry too much about wind going through my hives. Whereas I think Fantas are out in an open field. And so you're going to get a lot more wind coming through. She's also going to get a lot more sunlight when we have sunny days, rare ones in the winter. But she's going to get more sunlight during a day than I would because my hives are mostly under trees. So those are all different variables. You really have to learn your own hive situation and what works for your hives. Okay? Because everybody's going to be a little bit different. We already talked about altitude different. That Fanta's at a much higher altitude than we are here in Eugene. I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm in Cottage Grove. I'm at about 800 foot elevation. So I may get a little bit cooler temperatures and later spring than you do here in Eugene, but not as severe perhaps as where Fanta's located out in Dorina. So anyway, let's get back to the discussion here though. So I basically have the same setup. I do the same setup with a feeding box on top. My difference, however, and I think it's a fairly minor one, is instead of using a commercial feeder like this, a liquid feeder, I typically have a lot of canning jars. My wife does a lot of canning. So I've got a lot of the 1-pint canning jars, and I can put a couple of canning jars on top here with little holes punched in the top, and the bees can feed from that. I usually have a couple little wooden spacers on top to put the jars on. And it's worked very well for me. I don't fill the jar right to the top because then temperature differences may force some of the sugar. That's when I'm feeding liquid, by the way. I'll get back to that in a minute. But when I'm feeding liquid food, I can put the jars up there and the bees will feed off of those just fine. The other thing that I like Hamm said, is I can just take the cover off without disturbing the bees, see if they have how much food they've eaten, and replace it if necessary without tearing into the bottom, which I definitely don't want to do in the wintertime. But back to the question about liquid versus dry, right now I'm feeding liquid. Okay, temperatures, as long as they're staying above 50 or 55 degrees, I'm going to try to fatten up my bees for winter. There's not a lot of forage out there. We're into a dearth, so I try to give them a little bit extra. I don't want them going into the honey, which normally they won't. That's their winter storage. But I'm trying to fatten them up a little, help them along and fatten them up a little before we go into full winter. As soon as the temperature starts going, especially nighttime temperatures, go down below 50, and our average temperatures are below 55, I stop liquid. I'm not going to do any more liquid. I'm going to go to a dry food. My dry food of choice is typically like sugar blocks. I'll mix up little sugar blocks and put them in. Now, and another difference, I do have some hives where I have the styrofoam insulation that Hamm showed you, and I've experimented a little bit, and I've got some other hives where I use a quilt box. And this is a quilt box. And a quilt box is where I have screening on the bottom, and I have a quilt in here, which is an old pillowcase that's filled with wood shavings. Okay, I just go and buy the gerbil gerbil bedding, wood shavings, and fill a pillowcase with that, set it in here, and put it on top of my box, and it will absorb moisture. Now that's without tilting the box or any of that kind of stuff. So it will absorb moisture. This is another way of doing it. Which way is better? You can't really say. Do what's best for your hives, okay? You may have to try a little bit. This one, now one thing with this, unlike the approach that Hamm mentioned, is when I check on a warm day in the wintertime or in the fall, I need to reach in here and just check the wood chips. I want to make sure they stay dry. If I do get a lot of moisture absorbed and this gets soggy, I need to pull it out and put a new one in. So again, this is an absorption method rather than your insulation and condensation method.
Is it below the food or on top of the food?
This is above, well, it's above the food, and actually that's another point here because I will often take sugar patties and put them right on top here and put my quilt on top of that, and the bees can get in there and eat it. You may see some other ones where they make a candy board where they fill an entire board with sugar. That's another approach. So again, pros, cons, which way you want to go. You can read a lot online. I think we'll probably get a little bit more into it in our discussion and with a lot more questions. But again, as soon as the temperature goes down, I'm going to go to strictly dry food. And when we get into a couple of warm days in the winter time is typically when I'll go out. I'll just lift this, see how the food's doing, quickly cover it back up, check my quilt, the quilt, and if everything's dry, cover it right back up and I'm done. I have tried wrapping the hive. I've tried not wrapping the hive. I haven't seen a huge difference between them. The bees still make it through the winter, usually, knock on wood. They generally seem to do pretty well, but again, a lot depends on where your hive is located and your local temperature variations.
And how I bring a hive in the winter, and you can take the things you like from today and remix them and mash them up in your own bee yard and see what works for you, which is pretty much what I did my first year 4 or 5 years ago, and just kind of tried some different things. But I think kind of what Hamm said, and just in general, is like my winter prep started at the beginning of August. So my winter prep started when I pulled my supers, and the first thing I do is start treating, and the second thing I do is I start feeding. So I will leave a top box of honey or whatever's in the bottom 2 boxes, because my brood chamber's 2 boxes typically, and I go into winter with 2 boxes, and I go into winter with 2 mediums. So I don't really use deeps. I use 2 mediums primarily. That's just been my method, and that's what's worked for me. So I just leave whatever is in here for them, and I start feeding them 2-to-1 syrup. And the reason why I do that, and I made a little video about that feeding and stuff, is the first thing is it keeps them nice, because there's nothing out there, so it keeps them kind of happy and nice. And also, a lot of times they won't dehydrate that into honey and cap it off, and they'll have something a little bit easier for them to start eating, and they'll work from that. And so hopefully that's what they'll consume, instead of try to deal with all the honey inside the hive, but still keep that box for them. But yeah, I've always just done 2 mediums. And always is my brood chamber. This year was the first year where I took off queen excluders. Thank you guys, and let the queen lay up into the third box. But that box is gone. It's in buckets now. So, but anyways, yeah, I'll just talk briefly about what I do and how I like to overwinter, and with the equipment that I have. Personally, I don't like to have a lot of gear and stuff. I like to have things very simple. I have great storage, an amazing workshop, and I don't want to fill it up with bee crap. And so I try to have the least amount of stuff possible for that. So this is my winter configuration. It's 2 boxes. Brood will be down in the bottom typically, honey up top. And then I have this vent box on top. I keep these vent boxes on year round. So people will argue with, overwintering, ventilate, insulate, I don't know anything about that. I just ventilate all the time. I just have some vent coming. I also have a screen bottom boards that I leave on as well. So I have ventilation. That's just what I've kind of has worked for me specifically. You know, as you'll probably do, and questions came up tonight, is, you know, once I start feeding, then basically I do that until, like Hamm said, it gets average 55 degrees or less or whatever, because you don't want a big wet moldy mess inside of your hive. But you know, this method's been great for me. I have, you know, 5 to 20 hives that I go into winter with, and I've come out of every winter with 5 to 16 hives. So overwinter at like a 90% rate, and who knows what that is, but I think that's been, you know, treating for mites and having a good queen in there for the most part. But I've never lost a colony to starvation or mold or cold or anything like that. It's always been to mites, I presume. Yeah?
How do you feed?
How do I feed? Yeah, so the way that I feed going into winter is I'll put a super on top, and I have buckets that I have a bucket. I wish I brought it. I have, what's up? I have a bucket. So I take 1 gallon buckets and I cut a little hole in the top of the lid, and then I put really fine a stainless steel food grade a mesh wire on there, and I use a little heat gun to heat it and melt it onto there. And I take that bucket, I fill it, and then I take another bucket and dump it over into the bucket and squeeze it, creates a vacuum, and then I have little paint sticks on the top of the inner cover and just stick it on there, and then there's an empty medium box on there. That's the way that I go, and it's just easy for me, and the buckets, I just stack them up and whatever. So that's how I feed going into that. But, you know, I personally, I like the straps, and the reason why I like the straps is because I can heft my hives and just kind of go like this. Pick them up from the top cover and just feel how heavy they are. Listen, if you can't lift 70 or 80 pounds, you know, then you know your hive is good for winter. I try to go in at 80 pounds. That's kind of like where I go. And I kind of know what 80 pounds is. It's my dumbbell curls, you know. But I have a sense for what 80 pounds ballpark is, and that's kind of the weight. And I'm talking, I pick this up an inch, you know, and just feel it. And I do that all throughout the winter, and that's how I can, you know, without having to go in or anything, that's how I know like how hungry they may be. But again, I feed pretty vigorously until they stop taking it in fall time. So, you know, or it gets too cold. But you just want to make sure they can dehydrate it enough so you don't have this wet, moldy, hot mess in there. I'll show you what's kind of inside of here and just kind of what I do. So I do ventilation plus insulation as well. I've never insulated from the outside. I've never tried any of that stuff. I go and do my last inspection depending on weather, mid-October, and that's where I'll go and reconfigure anything in here. So, you know, if I notice there's a bunch of honey on both sides in the top or both sides in the bottom, I'll put that all to one side so they don't break cluster over winter. So I kind of put everything together. That's kind of just what I've been doing. And that's kind of it. I went in once at the end of August. I'm probably going to not go in. Maybe I'll go in once at the beginning of October and then the middle or end of October. But, you know, I'm just assuming they're queen right, and they do lots of weird stuff, culling their queen. I don't know, weird stuff happens. And so I just kind of let that happen because I know if they don't have a queen right now, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. Because there's no drones out there to make you give them eggs, nothing's going to happen. All the people who sell queens don't have queens for sale. So whatever, you know. I've already combined all the weaklings, you know. I do that, you know, at the end of August or whatever when I know they're a little weak. But I've overwintered bees in one box before, just put all the resources on one side, brood on one side, and you know, they've made it. So anyways, what I have in here is this vent box. I keep these on year round. For me, my theory with a screen bottom, you know, is that basically it just makes it easier for them to dehydrate the honey with the you know, allowing the air to flow through. This I don't have on there. This is a bee escape that's just on there for fun. But if you ever need a way to get bees out, these are
Yeah, those are
awesome. I think they're sold on Man Lake as professional bee escapes. But I bought these in Europe for £1 each, so like €1, and they're a little bit more here. But they're really awesome. They just you just plop them onto a screw, and the bees, you know. So you don't have to have a whole box. Again, like I said, I don't like have lots of crap. So these are easier to store than a whole separate escape situation.
Escaping from where to where?
Yeah, so when I'm trying to get them out for honey extraction, right, this goes on here. This goes on like this, and then the supers are on top, and then I leave it on for about a day, and after a day, they can't figure out how to get back up and in. Yeah, they go down, and then they can't get back up and in, and there'll maybe be like 20 or 30 bees I gotta blow out of there or whatever, so it's pretty minimal. I love these things, they're awesome. So for me, I've experimented with, this is what I use, just the insulating bubble wrap. You'll see I have a hole in the top, about a bee-size hole, and then I have a slit in the front. And I'll talk about that in a second. But typically I go in the winter with the notch facing up. One of the losses I had one year was because the bees died and the other bees couldn't get out. And I didn't know. And so the reason why I have the hole in the insulation is that if they need to get up, they can get up and out. And this doesn't, I don't think, is letting air into the hive as if it was flipped over. As things start to get warmer, though, I will go in and flip these over, and then with the slit, it will allow the bees to use the top entrance as we get to like February or whatever. So that's just what I've done. And the reason why I have the little hole in there also is because I never feed bees in winter. I've never ever given them sugar. I don't even know what the hell a pollen patty is. I've never done any of that. Like ever. I've just not, I feed them in August and September, and that's that for me. If we get to end of January and they're feeling light, too light for me, I always keep some crystallized honey around, and I just take this and I just put it in here, and they can go up through that little bee hole. You could put it upside down. You can see they've actually been snacking. They were snacking on this a couple winters ago, and they can just go up and eat whatever they want. I just literally put that over that. But usually they won't even touch this stuff. So that's kind of that. For me, with my mouse guard, again, I don't know if I need these, but I just put them on because someone told me to. I don't know if, I don't like them. And again, what I said when I had bees who couldn't get out, it was actually because I had the entrance like this facing down, and there was a bunch of dead bees that were blocking the entrance. They had no way to get out of the top. And so they basically just died inside of there. My due diligence is what I do if I'm going to use one of these is every couple weeks I'll go and pull it out, and I'll take a paint stick or something and I'll slide out all the dead bees that are on the bottom. That's kind of just been my deal for that, to kind of help them out and just keep all that shit out of there. They don't need that. But what I do is if I do use this thing, I put the notch facing up. So if dead bees pile up on the bottom, they can get out of the entrance right there. So that's just kind of that. So again, I use a mesh, whatever screen bottom board. I have the whatever coming the vent box up here, and then very small hole. So again, like air can get up. But I've never had any mold in my hives in spring. I've never had any moldy honey or funky looking stuff except for a colony that didn't make it, you know what I mean? But obviously, as you know, the bees are going to eat their way up to the top, and you're going to find them in here. So one thing I do in my last inspection is anything that's weird or funky, I make sure it's in the bottom box, because that bottom box is going to be empty in spring. And if I have a bunch of drone comb or stuff that I don't want in there, I'll put that in the bottom, and then when it gets to spring, when I go to flip my boxes, I'll take that stuff out and then put another box in there or whatever. So anything that's just you don't think you want in there, put it in the bottom box. And because they're going to be up here, so they're going to eat their way up here. But I've never had bees starve, and I've never had bees die from wetness or cold or anything. I'm on Lorraine Highway in Eugene, so I mean, again, your elevation and all these sort of environmental factors are going to make a difference. But I mean, again, this is non-scientifical, Andre, just saying based upon what I've done in my yard. This is how I've done it. So I have minimal equipment, less things to store, less to do. I don't want to do a lot. I'm not lazy. I just don't want to do a lot. So this is the not do a lot, Andre, methodology, or whatever.
So what I wanted to talk about is, because the accoutrements, everybody's got a different thing. I think the more important thing that I could give you right now is the preparation for winter. What do you do from today until the first you freeze to get your hive ready for winter? And as Andre and Hamm said, and we've already beaten to the ground that you need the good laying queen, low mite pressure, low virus pressure, and lots of honey. But one of the things that you'll see is you can actually optimize your hive for these situations. And so just kind of depending on what you have, we can work with both. So I'll help you out, and I'll try to throw out there too for the top bar sort of how that would look to help those that might have that. But we are starting this when we pull, prepping for winter, when we pull our supers. And this is the biggest kind of conundrum that I think that I notice with new beekeepers, is they always think they're doing their bees favor by leaving supers on top of their brood configuration. So whether you're using 3 mediums or 2 mediums or 2 deeps, it really doesn't matter. But you have to decide on what your brood configuration is. And your brood configuration are the boxes that stay on all year that the queen will lay in. In a top bar situation, your brood configuration is the bars that are closest to the entrance and exit. That'll always be the brood chamber for a top bar hive. And it generally is anywhere between 6 and 10 bars for that brood chamber to be. So when we're talking about this design here, one of the things is that we want to pull our supers on top early enough that the bees will have the chance to backfill the amount of honey they need. For me, I've done a lot of different experimenting in my 10 years of beekeeping, and one of the things I think that happens a lot of times is we're sort of shooting in the dark every year, and we're like, we'll try it this way this year and see what happens, and then we do it this way this year and see what happens, and then we're like, well, they died this year, they died that year. It's like the worst science ever, right? It's just like completely like not scientific in any way, shape, or form. So what I wanted to do is give you guys some solid recipes. And one of the things that I will say is, if you leave your super on too long, they don't know they're not getting that honey. So if you leave your super on past, say the first, and I'm probably a lot higher in elevation than most of you at 1,250 feet. So for me, the latest I can possibly pull a super is like the beginning of the second week of August, and that's kind of late to leave supers on. So when we pull that super off, we make a big communication to our bees. We let them know that they're not getting that honey, and that is a good communication to them, because once we pull those supers off at the first week of August, we've now communicated to them that they're not getting that honey. They got to get their little butts in gear and start to backfill the top of the nest. Because the truth is, if you leave a super, let's say I'm just gonna steal one of Hamm's boxes if that's okay. If I have this on top, let's take this down. And this is all full of honey, and I have brood in here, 9 times out of 10, what's going to happen is when I come to the inspections, that basically there's essentially 2 inspections left between now and the first freeze. If I come and I leave this on top, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to find a whole box of honey here, brood in here, and this box is going to be abandoned. This is going to have tons of pollen in it. And that is basically because they are moving the entire cluster up with the intention that this is going to be their overwinter. Then you wait until the 3rd week of August and you pull this off, and then what? they've only got maybe 2 frames of honey in here. This box is abandoned. And so that is too late to do this style. So by pulling it in the first week of August, you send that communication to them that this is the honey box. Now, if they've already got tons of pollen in the bottom, there's not going to have any room to put any brood down there. And this is a problem because this is what precipitates being honeybound the following year, is that they put tons of pollen in the bottom box, they have brood and honey in the middle box here, and essentially next year when they run out of honey, the queen has nowhere to lay. So one of the things that if you leave this on and you think you're doing them a favor, you have 2 deeps, you have a full box of honey, what they're going to do is they're going to simply move up here. This box again will be completely abandoned. You'll have brood in here and they'll have this honey. When you come back in the next spring in March at the spring equinox, when it's time to open up the hives, you're going to have an entire cluster, your entire hive of bees is going to be in this tiny box. So rather than by pulling this, you'll have 80 pounds of honey in this top box. You now have put this on, you think you're leaving more boxes on, you're helping them out, but this is actually only 50 pounds of honey. So this is less, these 3 boxes, it's not the boxes, it's what's inside them. So this configuration right here is actually less honey than this. And that's because when this is on, they aren't going to fill as much honey in these big brood boxes. So the goal for the way I start my winter out is pulling the top supers. Everything comes off except for your brood configuration. So by the first week of August. So this one goes down to 2 deeps. And I will say, 3 mediums is the same as 2 deeps, but for whatever reason, 9 times out of 10, when I have 3 mediums on, they always abandon the bottom box, and there's only ever things in 2 of the boxes. So like Andre, I generally do come down to 2, and I'll talk about why I do that in a minute here. But that is usually how I end up with 2 mediums, and I have a mix of everything. So I have hives that are like this, hives that are like that. It's not about the gear, it's what's going on inside, right? So as you can see, I have some little signs here, the brood bottom, honey top. Now, when you go into these hives, these last 2 inspections, it's not going to be perfectly arranged like this, right? You are in a human honeybee collaboration. This is part of what we do as beekeepers. I see this a lot with new beekeepers, is they don't know what to do and how to arrange it, and they just want to wash their hands and say, hopefully the bees have it figured out. Well, you've been making communication with them all along with the way that you've been using the gear. So depending on what you've been doing and how you've been moving things, they may or may not have this boxes organized like this. So one of the first things that we're doing in the last couple inspections that we're doing is we're starting to notice in the top box, you should be seeing the classic sunset pattern. So when you pull a frame in the top box, and this is more so within the last month, you will see cap brood, but it'll look like it's in a setting sun pattern, and it'll be all honey and then just a little bit of cap brood in a sun shape like the sun is setting. And that shows you that they're backfilling the top box. And that's what you want. You want them, this is how they would do it in nature, in a tree hive. This is how they do it in a warrior hive where they naturally move up and down. Is they move down and they backfill with honey behind themselves. And that is essentially how you get it. I personally, I'm a one-woman show. I have anywhere between 27 and 40 hives. I can't do lots of extra steps. And in all the 10 years of beekeeping I've done, I've experimented with all these different ideas, and I've seen what made a difference and what didn't. And if it didn't make a big enough a difference to warrant an extra step, that step's off the chopping block. And that's just because I can't do it all, you know? So one of the things that I've learned is a friend of mine, when I first started beekeeping, he had a FLIR camera and he lost his hive. And so he let me borrow it for the rest of the season. And I took tons of FLIR images. I was like addicted to it. I just couldn't stop taking FLIR images because it was so cool to be able to see. I don't know if you know what a FLIR camera is, but it's a heat sensing camera. So when you point it and you take a picture on the hive, it essentially shows you where the heat is. It shows you where the cluster is in the box, right? And by height, it shows a big red circle where the heat is the strongest, and it shows you how big the cluster is, where it's oriented in your brood configuration, all that. And what I observed is on the very first freezing nights, and I'm talking the very first, like October 1st, they abandoned this bottom box, and the entire cluster, they're making fun of my cluster of adult bees. So you've got a full box of honey, ideally, and you've got your brood down here, and on the very first freezing nights, they abandon the bottom box, and they come up, and they're hanging on the bottom of the top brood box filled with honey. And so it almost doesn't matter what's in the bottom box, because they are going to go broodless, and they're just going to be this adult cluster of bees, right? So anything, if you've got 2 boxes and you've got 2 deeps or 2 mediums, or let's say you have a mixed brood section like these folks over here where you have a deep and a medium, right? That situation is going to be that if there's the box, whatever this box is that you don't want to go with the following year, you need that on the bottom. Now, it may be too late to do that, because if all your honey is in one size in the top box, you kind of got to go with where your honey is at this point. You're not going to be able to magically make 60 pounds of honey go in the other box, right? So if that is a mixed brood configuration and you've got, let's say, a deep on the bottom and a medium on the top, then the next year, when instead of reversing, because this box is going to go empty no matter what, this box right here on the medium, it's going to go empty no matter what. They're all going to be in the top boxes in spring when you go to open the hive, and the bottom boxes are empty and abandoned. So you guys, if you had the deep on the bottom and all of them are in the medium, you pull the deep out and you add the mediums instead of adding the deep back and reversing. When you're using 2 deeps, you just reverse the boxes. But let's say you have some wonky comb. Let's say you have frames that they didn't build out. They're just raw, naked filmed frames that never got built out. All of those go into the bottom box, because when they abandon them, you want them to be down there, right? But we really need to aim to get a full box of honey on top. I've done a lot of different things where I've overwintered 1 single boxes, and I've overwintered nukes and all this stuff. But the real truth is you need 1 frame of honey for every 1 frame of brood. And that is a documented truth. So for every 1 frame of clinging bees and brood, you need 1 frame of honey. So if you go into your box and you pull open this time of year and you have 7, 8 frames of bees going into winter, you need 7 to 8 frames of honey in the top box for them. And that is just kind of the rule of thumb there. So, but for me, I'm going to get this box as full of honey as possible. So this time of year, if I'm going in my hive and I'm hefting it as they pointed out, and I'm pulling here and I can still move it a whole heck of a lot, then I'm feeding 2 to 1 until I can no longer pull this. And I just keep it on them constantly until they can. Personally, I do what is called a condensing hive. So the way Andre does it is called non-condensing hive, and Norm as well with this. This is a non-condensing hive because it's working on the principle of pulling and drawing the moisture up like that. What scientists have looked at this, and what they found about this is if your RR factor is high enough in the top insulation, it won't pull condensation to the top. Now I'm going to mix my terminology up because I actually didn't know the science behind it. Hamm explained it pretty beautifully, and I don't feel like I need to know all that personally to understand that the premise is the more air space you have on the top of the hive above your bee's head, the more moisture will go there if the RR factor isn't high enough. Now, wood chips doesn't have actually a very high RR factor. They've looked at all the different materials. This right here, the solar flex stuff, this is a 2, only 2 RR factor. And what's recommended on top to cause condensation not to cling is 7. So this, it says somewhere on it, but I don't know. I think it's like a 5, and then this is 2, so it works as 7. But as you can see, you can do this, like I normally see how this is all funky like this. this is because I normally would put this right down above the bars, right on top of the bars like that, because I don't want any airspace. The more airspace, the more it draws moisture. So like in the quilt box thing, I used to use this for years. Sometimes these would be sopping wet. And what I realized is it's literally catching its own moisture that it's making. So when you don't have this, it's dry as a bone when the RR factor is high enough on top, when it's warm enough. This Foamular board does a really good job, but the bees will chew it. And I didn't want them to chew it, so I started using this. And I lay this down first, and then I lay this on top of it, and then I put on a lid. And I actually do put my, I started putting my mite boards in just because closing my screen bottom boards, just because I like to look at the droppings throughout the winter and see what kind of stuff they're dropping. But I don't think it makes a big difference either way. But this is literally all I do to overwinter. The honey, again, is incredibly insulative. That's what I focus on, is getting as much honey as possible in this box. And then, so when you're going into your hive on the last 2 inspections between now and the first freeze, think about October 1st is kind of the gear, or the goal date there. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing is taking all the brood and getting all the brood lined up in the bottom box. So when I see that setting sun pattern, when it's capped brood up in top and there's just a little bit of capped brood and it's mostly honey, I'll leave that stuff up top. But if I see open brood, all open brood goes down into the bottom box. And if there's excess pollen, I pull those frames out now because I'm thinking about next year. And if there's too much pollen in the bottom box, they're gonna wake up before I start doing my first inspections, and she's not gonna have anywhere to lay if the whole bottom box is filled with pollen. So essentially what I do is I put all open comb in the bottom box, all brood in the bottom box as much as I can, and I try to get all the honey I can from the bottom box up into the top. I don't leave any honey in the bottom box. And the reason why is because they don't stay there long enough for it to warrant. I used to leave lots of honey all in both boxes. Every year in the spring, I open it up to 2 frames of completely moldy honey that they never ever eat. And I'm talking 10 seasons of doing this, enough to see that they aren't gonna eat that stuff. It's a waste to leave down there. That's just me. I would rather have it be all the way across the top in the top hive. And if it's not like that, start feeding now, because you only have basically to feed liquid sugar the rest of September and half of October before it's too cold for them to take it. And to the point about taking liquid feed in the winter, as we all talked about, they can't take things under 55 degrees. So the minute it starts freezing, that sugar water is going to be too cold for them to physically drink. So they won't be able to touch it, and it's just going to mold and create more condensation in the hive. The other thing is that's why I don't feed a light syrup, is because we don't want them to have to expend a lot of energy to get that down into something that can store well over winter. If you have lots of capped frames in your hive, it will create more condensation within the hive. So it's really good to try to get it as good as you can, filled and capped and all in your top box. And that's kind of the goal for me, because again, this cluster of bees, once they go broodless, they're going to abandon that bottom box, and this cluster is going to move up, eating all the honey in the top box until there's no more honey, and they're at the very top of the box. And usually when I come in my hives in March, they'll be all the way up in the top box, and there'll be 2 frames of honey on either side, and they will have eaten out the whole center, and they've been laying all kinds of brood, and I'll just come and take this empty abandoned box and I'll move it and put it on top. And then I'll start it right, and then that starts them over, and then they're putting more brood and getting bigger again. So that is the basics. Trying to think if there was anything else I was going to say about that. Oh, I know, the dry sugar thing. My goal is to have all this honey in the top. If for some reason I only had a couple hives, and like when I was first starting out, and I wasn't able to get this box as heavy through feeding or through adding more honey or any of that stuff, what I would do is then I would put dried sugar on going into winter. But if you have a full box of honey, as Andre said, like he never has it, I never add dried sugar to my hives if they have a full box of honey. It creates more drama, in my opinion, than it's worth. They don't need it if they have the honey. And what I'll do is I'll wait until January or February, and if the boxes start getting light, then I will add dry sugar as an insurance policy so that they have enough to overwinter. But that being said, I don't have to put that on pre-hand because I know they're going to have enough honey. Now, it's not good for them to brood up on honey in spring, but for me, I know that I'm going to be going in my hives in, around March 15th. And so at that point, if they're light, they'll still have honey in the top box. And if I want to brood them up at that point, I'm going to feed in spring. That's the time I prefer to feed, is in spring, to build them up and recover them from winter versus fall feeding. Fall feeding to me is something I do in an emergency because I haven't done a good job at pulling my supers quick enough so that they can backfill and get a whole box of honey. But my goal is to not ever have to do those things. That's a second to my plan A is do it like this and they'll do it naturally. Plan B is, oops, they didn't make it. Now I've got to help them a little bit.